All right, today we're jumping into a huge one. We're talking about one of the most watched legal decisions in India's recent history, the Supreme Court's big judgment on marriage equality. So, it all boils down to this one massive question. Is marriage a fundamental right in India for everyone? This was the core issue in the big case, Supriyo versus the Union of India. A five-judge bench had to figure out if the right to marry should also apply to queer couples. All right, let's really get into it. So here's how we're going to break it all down. First, we'll look at the big question the court was facing. Then, we'll dig into what both sides were arguing, the petitioners and the government. After that, we'll unpack the actual verdict, which is pretty complex. And finally, we'll ask, okay, so what now? All right, first up, a landmark question for India. You see, this case didn't just come out of nowhere. It was really seen as the logical next step after that huge 2018 decision that decriminalized homosexuality. Once that hurdle was cleared, the conversation naturally shifted to, well, what about full equality? What about recognition? That became the new frontier. And this whole thing was about so much more than just a piece of paper, more than a marriage certificate. The petitioners were arguing that this is about basic fundamental rights, the right to dignity, the right to make your own choices, and the right to be a full, equal member of society. And, they argued, a huge part of that is being able to form a legally recognized family. Okay, so let's get into the petitioner's side of things. How did they build their case? Well, this wasn't about an emotional appeal. Nope. They went straight to the source, grounding their entire argument in the solid bedrock of the Indian Constitution itself. This quote right here, it just nails their whole argument. Whenever someone said, oh, but society isn't ready for this was the comeback. Their point was crystal clear. Fundamental rights don't depend on a vote or a popularity contest. They're guaranteed by the Constitution, which operates on its own higher moral plane. So they basically built their case on these constitutional pillars. They said, look, denying marriage equality isn't just unfair, it's an outright violation of several fundamental rights. You've got Article 14, the right to equality. Then Article 15, which says you can't discriminate. Article 19, the freedom to express who you are and associate with who you want. And then the big one, Article 21, the right to life and liberty. And the courts have already said for a long time that this includes things like dignity and the right to choose who you spend your life with. And this brings us to this really key legal idea, constitutional morality. What does that even mean? Well, it's the principle that a court's first job is to protect the values that are actually in the Constitution. Justice, liberty, equality, even if society's views haven't quite caught up yet. The petitioners were pretty much saying to the judges, your North Star here is the Constitution, not what's popular on the street. And the way they suggested fixing this was actually pretty clever, pretty elegant. They weren't asking the court to invent a whole new law. Instead, they said just take the law that's already there, the Special Marriage Act, and read it in a gender-neutral way. Just interpret the words husband and wife to mean spouse. Do that, and boom, the law becomes inclusive overnight without having to tear it all down. Okay, so that was the petitioner's case. Now let's switch gears and look at the government's counterarguments. They came back with a really strong case, but interestingly, it wasn't so much about social norms. It was all about who has the power to do what. And this quote, this really gets to the heart of the government's whole position. Their argument was that something as big as defining or changing the institution of marriage, that's a job for Parliament, for the people's elected representatives. It's not something a small group of judges should decide on their own. So they broke their argument down. First, they said creating a whole new socio-legal status like this is Parliament's job, period. Second, they warned that if you change the marriage law, it would have this massive cascading effect on tons of other laws, things like inheritance, adoption, you name it. And finally, they pushed back on that spouse idea, saying that's not just interpreting the law, that's making law, that's judicial legislation. And really, this whole argument comes down to a core constitutional idea, the separation of powers. Think of it like this. The courts, the parliament, and the government each have their own lane to drive in. The government's whole point was that if the court went ahead and granted marriage equality, it would be swerving way out of its lane and right into Parliament's turf. So you have these incredibly powerful arguments on both sides, right? The whole country was on the edge of its seat waiting. So what did the court decide? Well, the 5 judges were not on the same page. The final verdict was a 3-2 split, and it's really nuanced. Okay, let's just get right to the headline. By a 3-2 majority, the court did not grant legal recognition to same-sex marriage. But, and this is a huge but, the story is way, way more complicated than that simple headline. The really important stuff is in the details, the why and the how they got there. This table here does a great job of showing the split, so let's just go through it. Now, look at those first 2 questions. Super interesting, right? All 5 judges, all of them, agreed on 2 key things. There is no specific fundamental right to marry in the Constitution, and the court can't just go in and change the Special Marriage Act. They all said that's Parliament's job. But then, look at the 3rd row. This is where it gets tricky. The minority, including the Chief Justice, said yes, queer couples do have a right to a civil union, a legally recognized relationship, and the government should create a way to do that. But the majority said no. The court can't force the legislature to create a brand new legal institution. And you can see on that last point about adoption, they were split there as well. But even with that split, you really have to pay attention to what they all agreed on. And this is huge. All 5 judges unanimously said that queer couples have the right to choose their partner, to be in a relationship, and to be protected from violence and harassment. They called this a core part of life and liberty. That right there is a massive, massive legal recognition of the relationship itself, even without the title of marriage. And this quote from the Chief Justice just drives that home. Even though they didn't grant the right to marry, the court came out swinging against discrimination. They called it deeply offensive to a person's dignity. So the message was clear: discrimination is not okay. So, okay, no marriage equality from the court. Where does that leave us? Well, the court didn't just say case closed and walk away. They actually pointed towards a different path forward. What they did was they ordered the government to set up a special committee. And this committee has a very specific job: to figure out how to solve the day-to-day practical problems that queer couples face. We're talking about really basic stuff, right? Like opening a joint bank account, getting on a ration card together, or naming your partner for your pension. Things that married couples take for granted. And, just as important, the court told the government to make sure the police stop harassing queer couples. So if you want to boil this whole thing down, here's the deal. What was gained? A huge, unanimous recognition of the right to be in a relationship, a strong stance against discrimination, and an order for the government to fix practical, everyday problems. What was not gained? The legal label of marriage or a court-mandated civil union. And that kind of brings us right back to where we started. In a really interesting twist, the court basically ended up agreeing with the government's main point about the separation of powers. All 5 judges said that creating the legal institution of marriage or civil unions, that's a job for Parliament. So the Supreme Court has pretty much tossed the ball right into Parliament's court, saying, we've recognized the relationship, now it's on you to create the legal status.